Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. With us this morning is Kathy Sinback. She is the new Executive Director of the ACLU here in Tennessee, replacing Hetty Weinberg, who had done so for 37 years. Wow, what a changing of the guard. Big shoes to fill, but seems like you're very enthused with this. And we can take calls if you'd like. I was saying during the break to her, most people, I think, recognize the ACLU from their involvement in various lawsuits. There is a whole legal side of what you do. I know there's much more to it than just that. But there will be lawsuits filed in cases where, and usually it's based on a constitutional issue, correct?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Anything that is central to our freedoms and our liberties, our civil rights in Tennessee, we are prepared to sue to protect those.
Yeah, and sometimes it may be an unpopular lawsuit for, you know, the public opinion on various issues can change over time. The ACLU doesn't pay attention to that. It's basically looking at the Constitution, the law. It's not like, well, who supports this more? Politics. What role do politics play with the ACLU?
We are political, but not partisan.
So you don't endorse candidates?
Correct. We endorse issues, not candidates.
Would you say that there are more members of the ACLU of the Democratic Party than the Republican Party nationally?
Nationally, yes, I would say probably. I think it's still, there's that perception that it's a liberal organization, but when you look at who we represent and how angry a lot of people on the left get very angry with the ACLU for representing white supremacists at times, for representing people who worked for Donald Trump, for advocating for Trump to get his platform back on Twitter. Those are the kinds of things that people get really mad about.
There's people right now, too, that didn't realize that type of thing. Now, you mentioned earlier about, Roe v. Wade decision going away, and I'm curious just how you view it. I know in the past, when it was the law of the land, and there would be issues with Planned Parenthood and things like this and access, and the ACLU would get in the middle of that. Now the law of the land is not that anymore, okay? And yet, you talked about how the ACLU is still looking for rights, that have been taken away from women on what they can do to their body. Now, I guarantee you there's people out there saying, well, no, this has been corrected. The law of the land is different, and these unborn children now have rights, is what the other side is going to say. How does the ACLU square that? Because you follow the Constitution, you follow the law. The Supreme Court has now made it. It is no longer the law of the land. And yet, you may still say, well, you disagree with it, perhaps? Does the ACLU disagree with the overturning of Roe v. Wade?
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
But, even though that is the law of the land now.
Yes, and that's a very interesting question.
How do you distinguish that then?
So the ACLU looks at things from an individual liberty or bodily autonomy standpoint. So they look at what are the things that are essential to us. Medical decisions are essential to us as people living in a free country. And so the ACLU's official position is that they are fighting to restore access to those medical decisions that should be between a woman and a doctor, especially in Tennessee. As I said, it is a crime for a doctor to terminate a pregnancy even if the mother is bleeding out. We saw a case recently where a woman had to ride for 6 hours in an ambulance because she was not able to have her pregnancy terminated at risk of her death here in Tennessee. And those are the kinds of things the ACLU is still taking the position, even though the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade, that is such an essential bodily autonomy, life and death situation for pregnant women, and just an issue that we're going to continue to push for. We're going to continue to push for restoring access to those medical decisions. It
is interesting as you look at all the dynamic. We had District Attorney General Glenn Funk on a while back, and the truth is, right now, Planned Parenthood in Tennessee is no longer performing abortions. They can't, and as you said, a lot of doctors, but abortions still occur because you can get those 2 pills. And those 2 pills, because in Tennessee it is the most restrictive. They actually in Tennessee, as you know, consider it illegal the instant of conception. The moment that sperm enters the egg, it's considered a living being. And all right, that's the way it sets up. It's the most really, I think restrictive of all the laws in the country. But abortions are still happening in this state because anyone can get hold of those pills and they can do it at home.
I think that's a real question. Can they?
Well, they can, and there's maybe 5% of the cases where they will have complications, and then they could go to a doctor, and the doctor recognizes what happened. That's where you wonder, General Funk was saying, if doctors will have to report that, in which case the individual could face charges. But you're saying you can't? Yes, you can.
Well,
you can get those pills and do it at home.
It is illegal to terminate a pregnancy.
Oh, I know, but it's happening, and no one's going to know. It's happening, no one's going to know.
I think there's a lot of people, though, who don't want to be criminals, who don't want to commit crimes.
True.
You know, they want to follow the law of the state. And a lot of people don't have access. They don't have access to medication. They don't have access to travel, funds to travel out of state. They may be in a life or death situation. But those are things, when we look at life or death kind of situations like that, the ACLU is always going to support the right for a person and their doctor to make decisions. There's also, you know, issues with the transgender community right now losing access potentially to healthcare rights with their doctors based on this issue with the Vanderbilt clinic that came up recently, and threats by people outside coming in and telling us as Tennesseans that we should not be able to consult with our doctors and make medical decisions in really important, you know, bodily autonomy cases that involve our well-being. And that is not conservative in my view. That is not, you know, my dad was in the military, career special forces, and did 2 tours in Vietnam. And he always taught me, my mom was an elementary school teacher, and they taught me that the reason he was in the Army was to fight for freedom, to fight for our ability to live our lives free as we wanted to, even if people don't agree with it. And that's why the ACLU represents all sides, because we believe that regardless of your opinion, regardless of your politics, that we should be free to make those fundamental decisions about ourselves, our bodies, our families, and that's what we're going to continue to fight for.
Interesting. I mean, that I knew that would come up, and it's curious to see how that'll play out. When we did go to the break, I mentioned about voting and getting out and voting, and yeah, so there are barriers. That number for Tennessee, that it was last in 2014 in voter turnout, is disturbing. I mean, you want representation, and well, who's voting and who's getting into office because no one's voting. What do you see in Tennessee, and what can the ACLU do to improve voter turnout?
So the ACLU has had very large voting rights, anti-voter suppression, and voting right restoration campaigns across Tennessee. We've gone into rural areas. We've taught people and worked with attorneys to help people in those areas to learn how to get their rights back if they've lost their voting rights. And we also encourage people on a regular basis to vote. I would be remiss if I didn't say that early voting is until tomorrow, and please go out and early vote. We also have the election, of course, on November 8th, but it is essential that people vote for the rights that are important to us, that you vote your values, and that you really understand where the candidates stand on these issues.
Yeah, you know, I mean, and I'll hit on this because I know you want to touch on it. I think it's much larger, but I mean, I never understood why a convicted felon who's paid his debt to society can't vote. I don't get that. Why? All right, yeah, you committed a crime, you were convicted, and you did your sentence, and it's done, okay? So once you pay your debt to society, you should be free and clear, unless you're in a case of maybe a sex offender where you get on a registry and there's concern about reoffenses. But I've never understood why the right to vote is taken away from convicted felons who have served their time. I just don't get it. It makes zero sense. If you think it makes sense, call and tell me why you think it does. But there's thousands of folks who have convicted felonies. That's bad. They were convicted, they paid their debt to society, and they still can't vote, right? Or they can, but it's a long process to get that restored, correct?
Absolutely. There are 451,000, to be precise, people who are of voting age who are currently unable to vote because of having felony convictions in Tennessee.
Wait, 450,000 in the state of...
In the state of Tennessee
450,000?
451,000
in the state of Tennessee alone. So there's millions nationwide.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
And so that's a huge number, and only a little over 3,000 have been able to get their voting rights back who were eligible to since 2016.
So well, listen, take your sip of water. We'll come back. We're going to take a break, and yeah, I want to pick up on that. So there's that big, and I don't know what it will take to change that, to make it more easier for folks to get there, but that's part of the process. And then there's other, issues of, just helping folks who are maybe, you know, with disabilities, low income, getting the documentation they need to vote. You need an ID, right? So we'll talk more about that with the new Executive Director of the ACLU right after this. Stay with us.